So this is a quick video on some of the issues of planning that I want to talk about that really aren't covered in the book. Again, this is not a replacement for reading the chapter. I expect you to do that, but there's some things I'd like to augment with. So planning is notoriously difficult. As was noticed in the 19th century, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And similarly, with respect for startup businesses, this has been paraphrased as no plan survives first contact with the customer. Right? Plans are something we do, but of course, it's hard to predict the future. So we want to make sure we're doing things effectively. So what's the question? Why are we doing planning? Well, Dwight D. Eisenhower, also in the military space, says that in preparing for battles, he has always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. The process of planning is actually often putting together a set of understanding of what are your resources, what is your team. The book talks about this TRIM model, which I'll come back to, right? Once you really understand all of those things, you can react more quickly with all of the knowledge you have. So, preparing in various ways for military things and exercise, right? Being prepared and having a plan, especially a plan with contingencies, allows you to do this. So, in lots of places, you'll see people talking about the business plan and business plan competitions. Business planning is difficult. The primary audience, if you're writing a business plan, are banks and formal investors. And the real purpose of business plan is to obtain funding. And it's generally a 25 to 100 page formal document with appendices and a bunch of details. This class, we're not building a business plan. Of the 3 successful companies I've been part of, only one of them had a business plan, and we didn't have it until we'd already secured the investors' interest and pitched to them and convinced them to invest in us. And then it was before the contracts happened, we want the final deal. So the startups I'm mentoring right now, I'm working with 6 startup companies. Not one of them has a formal business plan. 5 of them have gotten funding, right? So it's not the way of the world anymore to do this. But the process of developing some of the elements that go in the business plan will be part of pitching and part of trying to figure out what's going on. So in terms of the business plan, the chapter has a reasonable thing. I'll come back to of the TRIM model in just a little bit. But I actually think by far the biggest thing that was missing in a meaningful discussion, and the part of business planning that I think is essential, not the business plan, but business planning, is actually coming up with milestones and coming up with a way to manage what's going on. So milestones are really being able to figure out what do we have to have done by when. And often you can get to many of these by working backwards. So if the objective is to move into the office space on January 5th, one milestone might be to paint the office by January 1st. It might be to get the keys on January 1st, right? Before you can even paint it, right? Milestones come in lots of pieces. So you can go back from, if you wanted to paint the office on January 1st, what do I have to do to paint? What are the steps that I have to do that? So even before I could paint, I'd have to measure the office, which means I might have to get into it even before I'm allowed to move in, but maybe you can get in and measure everything. Maybe you don't have to measure too much to paint. You can walk through, you got a pretty good idea what's the square footage. But then you got to select the color, buy the paint, gather the tools needed. On the day of painting, before you actually paint, you have to take off and remove fixtures, take down the wall, cover stuff with drop cloths, decide who's going to paint it or hire somebody who's going to paint it. There's a whole bunch of things. We as humans are really good at some of these milestone processes, and some people are much better at than others. So even for this class, there's a bit of planning. If we have to have this presentation done because we're going to have our pitch on the week of for which week I'll get to that in a bit in the pitching slides. If we're going to have this done by then, we need these slides done by this day so we can practice. We need to get these slides. We need this information by that date. So that's what's going on. So if you think about what milestones are common to each group, right? Different things inside a company will have different kinds of things. So if you're going to launch a product, there's a product development and testing, product creation, marketing plan, building teams, strategic alliances, funding, investing, accounting, and launching. All of this is planning, right? How do we put all those things together? Who's doing what when? That's planning, and that's where milestones come in, is a way of communicating. These are the deadlines we want to get stuff done. So to do their milestone-based planning, part of it, a common part of this is what's called phase gate processing. And phase gates are really, you can't do something until something else is done. Okay, so if you can't do Z until you complete both X and Y, then X and Y are gates you can't go through until you get through them. So you can't take the Teams class in the Bachelor of Innovation until you've taken the NDP 1000. you can't create a manufacturing plan until you have a product's fully defined specification. On the other hand, you also can't fully define the product until you have some ideas of how it's going to be manufactured, because there's many ways of doing it. So sometimes the phase gates aren't as structured. You actually have an iterative process where these things interact with each other. I'm not going to go through all the details. And traditionally, you can view these as a timeline. This is a simple milestone chart. In many places, it's actually not done through a simple chart like this. It's done through what's called a Gantt chart, where you have ongoing processes, and the milestones are what sort of tie them back together, because you want to be able to say, okay, these things are happening in parallel by these groups, and then bringing them back together. Again, more detail than we're going to go into, but understanding milestones and setting them for yourself, and we're going to expect in your final pitch at the end of the semester for you to have a milestone chart, as what does it take to move the business forward. Milestone chart, to me, is the most essential part of business planning, or milestoning, not milestone charts. Business planning is all about making sure you're getting things done in time, and every business involves such planning, even if they never write a business plan. Okay. The chapter also talks about a couple of other types of business plans. So a short one, sometimes called an executive summary or a business brief. And this is something that would go to any potential investor, friends and family, advisors, other stakeholders. And every one of my companies has done executive summaries and business briefs. Right? We may not have a full formal plan, but we're going to have a business brief, because we have to have something. Even if we give a pitch, we often want to hand them something when we're done, and rather than handing them the pitch slides, we would hand them the business brief when we were raising money and meeting with investors, or even for some customers. So the idea is to have a very concise written document to provide interested parties that really describe your business model in some sense. It's a 2 to 3 page type professional document, so it's supposed to look pretty nice. And so you really want to have that kind of process as it's going on. So that's the only business plan I would expect you would need to do for anything you do in the next couple of years. You're going to start your business, drive it forward. If you're going to a bank for a loan, maybe you would need a formal business plan, and we'll talk about that later in the semester in more detail. But for now, we want to think of the brief explanation of your process. So one of the other things that is useful in the chapter is this idea of the TRIM framework. This is also a useful way of thinking about how to present your stuff, and TRIM is just a good acronym. Team, resources, idea, and market. And if you are pitching and you have a very established team of senior people who have done multiple startups, this is in fact often how you might even present your business. And it seems a little bit odd to say I'm going to present it with a team first, but the team is often the most important thing, because a good team can pivot and change their ideas along the way. More important than the idea is the team for lots of seasoned investors. But in this class, we're definitely not going to pursue this path, because most of you aren't the seasoned team, so you don't want to lead with that because it would sound weak. You might have a team slide at the beginning just to introduce yourselves, but you're not focusing on the team. So in the TRIM model, right, you talk about who's on the team. Now, this can also be important for your as you're building your business. These are important questions for planning, not for a pitch, but because you want to figure out who needs to be on the team. What are the skills we need to have? What do those people bring as we try to bring them into the company? So who's on your team is very, very important. There's also the questions as you're building your team. How are you dividing who owns it? How are you splitting up your the assets of your company? And where do those people all want to go? So if you don't have an effective team, the startup companies tend to die. Now, in this class, you don't have much choice about this. You were all assigned to be on the team, except for the one team that's self-selected. So we're not going to dwell too much on these questions, but they are important questions for you to be aware of if you ever go to do a real startup company. The resources, what do you currently have for a business, right? What are your cash resources? What are your technology resources? All of those things are important, again, when you're doing your planning. So the sort of checklist of things to walk through. For your idea, when you're presenting it, and also when you're trying to deal with it, there's important questions like, how do we describe it simply? How is the idea unique or differentiated? How are you going to protect your idea? What is its value proposition? What are the needs of being met? And these can be very important, because if you can't describe them well or answer these questions, you're not ready to move forward as a business. Now, in this class, you're going to be driven to answer lots of these, or maybe all of these questions. And the next section, the market segment, is also very important. We're going to be driving into answer these. Who are your primary customers? What do they care about? How do you reach them? How will they hear about your product or service? How do you keep them? How much does it cost to get each one? What are they willing to pay? What feedback have you gotten? So your customer interviews right now, we're trying to drive you to help begin to answer these two sets of questions. The team and resource questions, while they're important to the TRIM framework and they're very important for real startup companies, they're often things that in this class we're not going to dwell on as much just because we don't start you with the right set of activities. We're trying to get you to understand the parts you can more easily change. So the last part the chapter talks about is this idea of the pitch deck. I'm going to have a whole other set of slides on pitching, where your primary audience are your investors, incubators, accelerators. You're trying to obtain funding and, more importantly, obtain resources, which might be meeting with potential investors, meeting with partners. Your pitch deck might be specialized for each of those. The book presents it as though it's a 10 to 20 slide professional presentation. I'll go through lots of different examples of that as we go through the pitch deck slide. So that's it on planning. Planning to pitch is another part of the planning we're going to you're going to be doing in the next couple of weeks. That's it. Thanks.